Israel are allowed to participate. That's in a few minutes here on BBC Radio 4.
Mozart, perhaps the most famous composer of all time.
He played the violin, organ, singer.
Beatboxing.
But what do we really know about the man behind the music?
Is it true that he would book in a concert for like the week after next and then write the thing? His agent on the phone,
Hey Wolfie, I got a gig for you. I'm Greg Jenner, and in a 1 hour special here on BBC Radio 4, I'm going to find out about Mozart's life through his music.
I'm thinking punting past the Eiffel Tower, which isn't built yet.
I'm joined by Dr. Hannah Templeton, the comedian David O'Doherty, and live music from the BBC Concert Orchestra. You're Dead to Me, Mozart, on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds. Tomorrow morning at 10.
BBC News at midday. The Met Police says it's continuing its investigation into potential offences at the Post Office over the Horizon IT scandal and has interviewed 2 people under caution. Yesterday, the BBC revealed that a previously undisclosed report had shown the company was told about faults with the computer system in 2017, but the Post Office went on to spend £100 million of public money fighting a group of more than 500 branch managers in court. Janet Skinner was one of them. She's a former sub-postmistress from Hull who was wrongly jailed.
They could have prevented that court case. Do you know, 555 people that went to that court case, they could have prevented that, and they could have saved a lot of time, money and tears.
The Post Office said that it was deeply sorry for the impact the scandal had had on people, and the next phase of the public inquiry would look at the issues raised. Rishi Sunak is facing criticism for recommending a knighthood for a top Conservative donor. Businessman Mohamed Mansour is a senior treasurer at the party and donated £5 million to the Tories last year. Claire Pearsall is a former Conservative special advisor. She has concerns about the knighthood.
The optics of a donor, £5 million to the Conservative Party 1 year and a knighthood the next, just looks really, really bad. And I think it brings down the honours system. It removes away what it should be for. Why isn't it for people out of the community? Why aren't they being honoured at Easter?
A 19-year-old man has been charged with attempted murder and with possession of an offensive weapon in connection with a stabbing on a train near Beckenham in London on Wednesday. A man in his 20s is in a critical condition in hospital. The police service of Northern Ireland has said that a 61-year-old man has been charged in relation to sexual offences. The 57-year-old woman has also been charged with aiding and abetting additional offences. Both are due to appear before Newry Magistrates Court later this month. Soldiers and officers are to be allowed to grow beards while serving in the British Army. The change in policy brings the Army into line with the RAF and the Royal Navy. Alan Mackenzie reports.
The Army has spent months reviewing its policy on the appearance of personnel. The consultation is reported to have involved the King, politicians and Britain's military allies. An Army spokesperson told the BBC it had listened to its people and acted to remove the ban. Troops have been told that beards and moustaches must be neat, properly groomed and will be routinely checked. The Army has also warned there may be certain occasions where personnel are required to be clean-shaven. Troops of certain faiths, including Sikhs, Muslims and Rastafarians, were already allowed to grow full beards, providing the facial hair did not put their operational effectiveness at risk.
Aberdeenshire Council has apologised after parents at a school were offered a class photograph which did not include children with complex needs. Families with children at Aboyne Primary School were sent a link from Tempest Photography which allowed them to choose alternative pictures. The company says it's investigating. One of Natalie Pinnell's daughters was excluded from the photo. She told BBC News how it felt to see her child removed from the picture.
Furious, devastated, heartbroken. It's been a crazy week of emotions. There's rage, there's pain. This is a school that really prides itself and works towards a model of inclusion for these children. For a photographer to come and allow options, the choice as to whether certain children should be in a picture or not is just beyond belief.
And travellers flying away on holiday this weekend have been warned their Easter eggs might pose a security threat. Heathrow Airport has said cream eggs could breach the rules on carrying liquid, while Bristol Airport says passengers may have to take their chocolate eggs out of the packaging to be inspected. BBC News.
Now on Radio 4, it's time for Antisocial.
Hello, I'm Adam Fleming, and this is the Antisocial podcast from BBC Radio 4. Each episode, we take one subject that's big online and look at it from a load of different angles. A spam filter, firewall, and antivirus software for your brain. This week, it's the Eurovision Song Contest soon. The cinema in East London isn't going to host its usual watch party because Israel is in the competition. At least one country calls for Israel to be banned, like Russia was a few years ago. Cue a debate about whether a cultural boycott is a valid response to the conflict with Hamas.
I want to be able to watch the Eurovision this year. It gives me so much joy, but I will not be able to watch it if Israel take part.
We have people putting their political views using cultural mechanisms, and that's not acceptable.
Israel's very presence at Eurovision becomes a message to the world. We are totally...
We chart Israel's participation in the competition. And this isn't the first time Eurovision has become political. We'll look at when the contest has become contested. And if you want to get involved in the discussion online, you can use the hashtag BBC Antisocial. And with me throughout this episode of Antisocial are two people who come at this discussion from quite different perspectives. Jeffrey Ingold is a freelance writer covering LGBTQ+ issues and culture. Hello, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Where would you rate your Eurovision fandom?
Like a 6.25.
Is that high?
I think that's just above average.
Okay. Does that mean you would go to a Eurovision party, or you would watch it at home, or...?
I have been to Eurovision parties throughout the year, and then I went to Eurovision last year when I was in Liverpool. So it's sort of, I've been watching Eurovision for about 10 years, and every year I get more and more into it. But I respect the fandom enough to know that I'm nowhere near the top echelon of knowledge.
Okay, interesting caveat there. You wrote an article for The Guardian which said you can't watch Israel take part in Eurovision. Why did you say that?
Yeah, I did, because I think Eurovision at its core and sort of what it professes to be is a song contest about unity, peace and cooperation. And fundamentally, as it stands right now, Israel is engaged in an illegal occupation, an invasion of Gaza. And to watch a song contest in which it is meant to be about promoting unity among people whilst one country is sort of committing crimes against humanity, it's really difficult. I don't know how to square those two things. It goes against what I believe Eurovision stands for and sort of provides an excuse and justification for it, also considering they banned Russia 2 years ago for their invasion of Ukraine. It feels like a double standard.
And just to be clear, that's crimes against humanity you feel they're committing, because that's not being proven in a court. Josh Kaplan is head of digital at the Jewish Chronicle newspaper, and he's here too. Hi, Josh.
Hi, how are you doing?
Are you a Eurovision fan?
Probably around a 5. I watch it most years. I enjoy the sort of Graham Norton commentary, but not a big stan now.
Okay, and in your job at the Jewish Chronicle, have you noticed how loud the calls for boycott have been?
Yeah, I think, look, the discourse around this war since October 7th has been absolutely insane. You know, it's been one of those things that everybody has an opinion on, everybody has a take on. There's calls for this, calls for that, and I think as the conflict's unfolded, we've seen kind of the discourse amp up to a point where I think it goes beyond what I would think is rational kind of feelings towards Israel, and it becomes this sort of all-encompassing bogeyman that people project all their hatred onto.
Oh, do you think this conversation then about Israel's participation is a bit irrational?
I think cultural boycotts of Israel as a whole are not a particularly productive or helpful thing. I think if you have to look at what your overall aim is with a cultural boycott, right? I don't think it's something that leads to cooperation. I don't think it's something that leads to coexistence. I don't think it's something that leads to peace. It's basically shutting your eyes and pretending Israel doesn't exist, right? And I don't think that's going to solve anything.
And I don't ask this question with any kind of agenda, but you've got family living in Israel, haven't you?
Yeah. My grandma's in Israel. My sister was living in Tel Aviv until last year. You know, I've still got a family there.
Okay, right. Israel's Eurovision entry is a song called Hurricane. Shall we listen to one in a minute?
Baby, promise me you'll hold me again. I'm still.
But it wasn't always called Hurricane. The title and the lyrics have been controversial inside and outside Israel. To get us up to speed on the song's backstory, here is our Middle East correspondent, Yolanda Nell.
Well, Eden Golan, the singer, was chosen on the Israeli TV talent show called Rising Star. And there's kind of a combination of judges and audience votes for that. Then there was a team that came up with her song October Rain as this year's original Israeli Eurovision entry, and that song of course was heavily influenced by the deadly assault by Hamas that Israel suffered on the 7th of October, in which 1,200 people were killed and some 250 taken hostage according to the Israeli government figures. It was the trigger for the current brutal war in Gaza, which has killed more than 32,000 people according to the Hamas-run health ministry there. Now, I mean, the original song had some lines that obliquely referred to ongoing events and to the trauma of those, like those that write history, stand with me, I'm still wet from this October rain, or just the title of the song. And in Hebrew at the end there were some lines, there's no air left to breathe, and they were all good children, each one of them. They were seen as being related to what happened.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious when you read the original lyrics. But though we've been using the phrase original lyrics and original title because they were both changed to some extent.
That's right. So Eurovision organisers basically disqualified first submission on charges that it was politically motivated. They said it broke the rules of the competition. And then you had Ham, Israel's public service broadcaster, declaring it was going to really refuse to submit a new song or edit the lyrics at first, but then later, after some weeks of this going on, it agreed to rewrite the song and it put in a new submission. So October Rain became Hurricane, so it's kind of more generic. And although you still have some lines which could be interpreted as referring to recent events, like look into my eyes and see people look away but never say goodbye. Even things like every day I'm losing my mind and I'm still broken from this hurricane. You still have Hebrew at the end, but it's a bit different now because we don't need grandiose words, just prayers, even though it's hard to see, you always leave a small light for me. So those were the changes that were made.
Yeah, the new lyrics seem to be kind of more general references to painful situations rather than specific references to a specific situation, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. They're open much more to interpretation, and that was criticised by some in Israel who really thought that it should be more powerful, that Israel should have the right to put its sort of national pain out there. Others, though, of course, really wanted this to be something that was accepted by Eurovision.
And is it true that Israel's president got involved?
That's right. We had Isaac Herzog really pressuring the Israeli broadcaster to allow October Rain to be changed, and he spoke publicly about how important it is for Israel to participate in Eurovision because it's watched by hundreds of millions of fans all around the world.
And is it possible to say just how much people are talking about this issue in Israel? I mean, obviously there's bigger stuff going on there.
Of course, yeah. I mean, the big news headlines are dominated by what's happening in the war and what's happening in politics. But, you know, this was a big sideshow for the Israelis for some time. I mean, like I said, many Israelis were unimpressed at the Eurovision demands, and you actually had a provocative parody song that went out on Eretz Nehederet, a wonderful country. This is a really popular Israeli TV show, kind of the equivalent of Saturday Night Live in the US. Lyrics in it saying it was Hamas that started when they crossed the fence, and every nation has an inherent right to self-defense. We're a nice nation. We act with the intention to follow international rules and regulations. Also some line about, to boycott us will be a huge regret that reminds of us a time we all want to forget. So, I mean, that gave voice really to some of the strong opinions that there were in Israel around this.
And what, if anything, are Palestinians saying about this?
I mean, there's not really been much that I've seen in the way of comments from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But you have had several pro-Palestinian activist groups abroad which have been really calling for a boycott of Israel in Eurovision this year. I mean, Israel's faced this boycott campaign for some months now. You had the European Broadcasting Union repeatedly dismissing any such attempts, saying that Israel's Khan public service meets all the criteria to participate in the competition, that this is a competition among public broadcasters, not governments. It's supposed to be non-political in nature. But then you've had some European ministers even pointing out that Russia was excluded from Eurovision following its invasion of Ukraine. Interestingly, at one stage it did look like a Palestinian singer, a guy called Bashar Murad, who's born in Jerusalem, might go through to represent Iceland at this year's Eurovision contest. He was the heavy favourite, but in the end he didn't make it.
Thanks to Yolande Nell. Josh, what did you make of the controversy around the original lyrics?
Yeah, I think it's kind of understandable, right? You know, I think if the Eurovision is going to claim to be anti-political, it had to probably take some steps, and I think it's probably right that they remove those lyrics that were probably a bit too obvious a reference to October 7th. I think fundamentally the Eurovision probably just wants to avoid any sort of controversy, and I think this was kind of the compromise they found to do it.
Do you think, though, that the songwriters and the public broadcasting putting the song forward made a misjudgment in the first place? Because they knew what the rules were.
Yeah.
And yet they wrote a song with very clear lyrics.
Yeah, of course. But I think it's important to recognise the strength of feeling about this issue and about October 7th in Israel. I was in Israel a few weeks ago, and it's very much like their 9/11, you know, their Manchester Arena, their London Bridge, whatever. It's like a really, really still, very raw, very painful moment. And so it's not really that surprising to me that it kind of came out in this kind of songwriting process. I think it's, to a certain extent, it's all people want to talk about. But yeah, I do think it's right they probably turned it down a bit.
Jeffrey, I imagine your issue isn't with the lyrics or the content of the song, it's Israel's presence full stop. But what do you think about the fact that the songwriters listened to international criticism and changed the lyrics?
I mean, I think I would challenge that question in a little bit, because I don't necessarily... It is not necessarily just that Israel's performing. I think part of the position I take is also because one day after Russia invaded Ukraine, the European Broadcasting Union put out a statement that essentially said, we condemn what's happening. You know, if we were to have Russia in the contest, that would bring the contest into disrepute. I think was sort of the language they used. There has been no similar statement made about the invasion of Gaza. And so I think part of the problem is not just Israel's performance and the song, it is that there has been no similar stand made against to recognize the suffering that Palestinian people are going through. And I would qualify that and also say, I do think it is important to recognize that what happened on October 7th, as Josh eloquently pointed out, is hugely important to Israeli people. It is a huge tragedy, and that should be condemned. But I think it is the imbalance of having one voice getting to perform a song in front of 160 million odd people, and Palestinian people will have no voice at all. You know, in 2019, when
they didn't have one before.
Well, no. Well, I think so. Eurovision has a history of silencing sort of pro-Palestinian protests. So in 2019, when it was held in Tel Aviv, there was lots of new, like the conversation around boycotting Israel fairly regularly. Hatari, who was the entrance for Iceland in that year, when they were shown on screen, they held a Palestinian flag. They were then fined by the European Broadcasting Union for doing that, and then in the official DVD, I don't know if anyone still watched DVDs in 2019, that was scrubbed from the sort of official footage. And so I think there's a wider problem that the European Broadcasting Union has around politics when it comes to Palestine.
Okay, we'll come on to some of those issues, but Josh, did you watch that moment a few years ago when Hatari pulled out the Palestinian flag? How did you feel?
Yeah, I mean, that was, I kind of maybe watched it with a different view. Like, I was very proud that Israel had won the year before and watched in Tel Aviv, and, you know, it's nice to see this kind of big, you know, party, and it was a very, I think, successful Eurovision. I do remember that, and, you know, it didn't really register to me as something that I would find beyond the pale. I think, you know, people are entitled to non-violent peaceful protest. I think it's a completely legitimate view to have.
So maybe they should have kept it in the DVD.
Yeah, but I think if you look at the way that a lot of big corporations, especially something like Eurovision, which has to juggle all these like political balls, deals with this is that they just don't want to deal with this, right? They don't want to deal with any sort of controversy, any sort of anything. So I'm not surprised that they got rid of it.
Jeffrey, what about that point that it's not a sort of it's not an anti-Palestinian thing or a pro-Israel thing, it's just an anti-anything that could be seen to be controversial. I mean, this show goes out on a Saturday night. It's not politics at all. It's just caution of a big entertainment behemoth.
I see that to a point, but I think sometimes what Eurovision does is it confuses politics with morality. And what I mean by that is often there's a history of Eurovision, and the Eurovision buffs will know this much better than I will, of the way in which sometimes countries are able to sneak politics or messages about issues happening in their country into the war. So in 2013, Finland had a song called Marry Me. And the song everyone thought was about this person wanting to marry whoever they were in love with, but actually the song was about encouraging the state to encourage same-sex marriage.
Do you know what, I'm going to stop you there because later on we're going to hear from the guy who has literally written the book on, like what you used to be able to do with DVDs, skip the chapter. And he's written the book on just that subject about how the politics has come in sometimes and sometimes been allowed and sometimes not. But just, Jeffrey, based on some of the things you said, that gives me an opportunity to read out some of the statements that we had from the EBU. So in terms of not banning Israel, EBU said in their statement, "We understand the concerns and deeply held views around the current conflict in the Middle East. We can't fail to be moved by the profound suffering of all those caught up in this terrible war. However, the Eurovision Song Contest is a non-political music event and a competition between public service broadcasters who are members of the EBU. It is not a contest between governments." So Jeffrey, I mean, does that sort of clarify things for you? Because you'd said the EBU hasn't made any statements in favour of people suffering in Gaza. They sort of just have.
I don't think that necessarily, I think that's a sort of equivocating statement, and I think it's also, it shows the way in which the EBU is inconsistent in how it applies its approach around what's political, because I think Russia is one example to look at, but I think Belarus is also a really interesting example, who've also been banned from the contest. They got banned for about 3 years, and that was specifically because the broadcaster that competes broke the rules around impartiality and independence in the way that it was covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it was sort of regurgitating the sort of state media. And so I think there's a similar case and parallel case there you can make to the way in which the Israeli broadcaster, which is sort of what they're alluding to there, is this is about broadcasters, not states. And so I say to them, well, if it's about broadcasters and not states, why is it that Khan's sort of coverage of the Israeli invasion in Gaza and what's happened is not under the same rules as what apply to Belarus?
Okay, Josh, explain then. I mean, I don't know how much of the coverage you've watched of the Israeli public broadcaster. Is it almost belligerent and maybe not like what you'd expect from, I don't know, say another impartial public broadcaster in another country, not naming any names?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in Khan or what they broadcast, but from watching Israeli TV news is that what you see is understandably much more coverage of the Israeli human stories. You know, there's obviously coverage of the war in Gaza, there's pictures of what's happening in Gaza, but their focus is, and as I'm sure all public broadcasters do, they respond to what the audience wants to see. And the audience wants to see stories of Israeli suffering because that's what they're feeling and that's what's reflected to them. I haven't watched every single second of Khan's output since the war started, and I don't know what their coverage is like, but generally speaking, I would say they are balanced, but probably reflective of the country's needs.
But Jeffrey, how else could Khan cover the conflicts that's affected their own people?
I think there's been concerns and criticism mounted about the way in which Khan has regurgitated and sort of repeated things from the Israeli government, the Israeli Defense Forces, that have not necessarily always held up to scrutiny in the same way. And so it's about that, which is essentially what Belarus was doing as a broadcaster. But I think there's still, I think, so getting into the nitty-gritty sort of forgets the point that we're sort of generally talking about, which is that I think the Broadcasting Union set a precedent when it banned Russia and sort of Belarus, and it's not applying the same standards here. And fundamentally, if we're looking at a contest about peace, how do you square that with having a country perform who are currently engaged in war?
Well, that then leads me to the next bit of the EBU statement, which is about how they handled Russia. And the EBU said it has been widely acknowledged that the Russian broadcasters were spreading propaganda and disinformation regarding the invasion of Ukraine. Indeed, the broadcasters and some of their more prominent presenters were placed under international sanctions by the EU and Switzerland, which to me sounds like it was the EBU saying that the Russian public broadcaster wrote the terms and conditions for being a member of Eurovision, rather than it was like Russia as a state being excluded from the contest. Josh, just explain why somebody looking at this from your point of view, well, just explain how you reacted to what Jeffrey said about comparing Russia and Israel and their actions.
Yeah, I think it's important to realise that no other conflicts in the world can be copied and pasted onto Israel. People love to do it with Russia. People love to do it with South Africa when they accuse Israel of apartheid. They love to basically take other very complicated, messy conflicts and paste them onto this incredibly complicated, messy conflict. And I think that fundamentally misses the nuance. The difference, to my mind, is that, you know, when Russia began its invasion of Ukraine 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember, it was a naked sort of territorial land grab to a country that hadn't done anything wrong, right? That's just kind of the facts. Regardless of whether you agree with Israel's response since October 7th, you cannot argue that there was no provocation, that there was no initial sort of, you know, terrorist attack that preceded this. And I think the context is incredibly different. And I think it's when you boil stuff down to saying, oh, Israel's Russia, Palestine's Ukraine, you're missing the nuance, and you're kind of ending up with this argument that doesn't really make sense to people who've actually experienced it.
No, we could probably spend hours just talking about the nature of the conflict, and we're trying to sort of steer away from that and focus just on this issue of what you can do culturally and what's right and wrong there. So as part of that conversation that's been happening online, you see a lot of tweets that go along the lines of this. But like, why is Israel even in Eurovision? This is supposed to be Europe in capital letters, and that is an interesting point. So why did Israel join Eurovision in the first place? I asked Daniel Rosny, a freelance journalist covering the song contest for lots of different places, including the BBC, where he was a presenter on the podcast Eurovision Cast.
Eurovision was created by the European Broadcasting Union, which is essentially a bunch of broadcasters around Europe. And in 1950, the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, was created. About 6-7 years later, they decided to do a broadcasting experiment because they wanted to broadcast the same thing in lots of countries, and they came up with a music competition. Israel is part of the European Broadcasting Union. It pays its membership, and the EBU's big thing really is to share news footage and sports rights, that kind of thing. So from 1973, Israel has been in Eurovision, and it was the first non-European country to take part in the song contest.
And how well have they done?
They've won it 4 times. They won it twice in the 70s, so quite quickly after entering. Then they won it in Birmingham in 1998, down at International. And then they won it again in 2018. So that meant it was in Tel Aviv the following year, and that was the first year I went to Eurovision.
And yeah, what was going on that year when they were hosting it?
So there were troubles a couple of weeks before I travelled to Tel Aviv. There was a flare-up in Gaza. So as part of my coverage for BBC News, I was working at Radio 1's Newsbeat at the time. I spent some time in Gaza, and we made some programmes from the Palestinian territories because we felt it was important to show what was going on in the region, as well as sort of reporting on this glitz, this glamour, this sequined event that was happening. So every time Israel has been in Eurovision, especially when it's hosted it, this issue of the conflict always does come up.
And so how was that manifesting itself kind of at the actual competition at the time?
Well, there were some Eurovision fans who normally travel. They said that they didn't want to go to Israel. And there were a lot of artists at the time who didn't want to talk about it, but there was one act, Hatari from Iceland, who were probably the most vocal of the bunch of that participants that year. And actually when they were getting the results,
Iceland, are you ready? 186 points.
Iceland held up a Palestinian flag in the arena, and as you can imagine, there were boos in Tel Aviv.
And we go to France. Our next country is France.
What happened to Iceland then when they showed their Palestinian flags? Because the camera cut to them and you could see it as a viewer.
Yeah, so Eurovision is a broadcasting event. Even though the countries are named, it's actually the broadcasters. So for the United Kingdom, it's the BBC. For Ireland, it's RTE. So the Iceland broadcaster, RUV, they were fined the following year, and they had to pay that fine in order to participate again because its act had broken some of its rules.
And also just give us the background to Israel's public service broadcaster.
public service broadcasters in the EBU change. So Khan is Israel's current broadcaster which participates in Eurovision. And when it won in 2018, it was a fairly new broadcaster. So then when it had to put on the competition the following year, because that's the prize really, the broadcaster that wins gets to put it on the following year and show all the other broadcasters how great it is. They were struggling financially because they were brand new. And they went to the Israeli government essentially asking for some money, and Netanyahu said, no, you've got to pay for this yourself. And there was a lot of reporting at the time that was because the competition was in Tel Aviv and he wanted it to be in Jerusalem. But it is also not unusual for governments not to pay to host Eurovision.
And what does Israel's participation in the competition mean for Arab nations?
So there aren't really any of the big Arab nations from the Middle East who take part in Eurovision. There has been some talk in the past of countries like Lebanon who may want to join, but they haven't, and there's been some reporting historically that their government doesn't allow the promotion of Israel culture on media, that they wouldn't be able to participate because they wouldn't be able to show the Israel performance, and the EBU rules say that you have to show everything. But there are some countries in it, like Albania, which nearly 60% of its population are Muslim, and it's never really been an issue on stage with the participants that I've seen when I've been covering it. But this year definitely does feel more heated, and speaking to contestants and speaking to teams, the teams around the artists are definitely being a bit more wary about what the acts and the participants say, especially on social media.
Thank you to Daniel Rosny, who was elaborating on some of the anecdotes that we were referring to a bit earlier on. Josh, what do you think participation in Eurovision actually means for Israel as a country? What do they get out of it?
I think it's a sense of pride, right? Like, I think anybody wants to see their culture recognised on a sort of European stage. I think people like it when Israel does well. There's if you speak to Israelis, especially like my parents' generation, they all remember Dana International winning. People of my sister's age, who's a few years younger than me, they remember Netta winning. It's a nice feeling to win, right?
And also, Jeffrey, I mean, when we were listening to that, you sang along to Netta's entry. Why is that okay from your point of view?
Because
in mind what you've said.
Because it catches in my brain, and it's a song that I've heard lots of times, and people are
It's involuntary.
It is a gay habit, and but I think people are complicated, right? And I think a catchy song is catchy, but I think that doesn't necessarily diminish from the fact that I think Israel's entry is is a sort of a stain on the contest as it is right now.
Josh, is it fair that people ask questions about Israel's participation? And I don't mean on a kind of like questioning the moral existence of Israel, anything like that. I just mean it's in a unique situation in the world that most other countries aren't in. So most other countries don't get asked those questions.
No, not at all. And you can't avoid that, right? You can't avoid people having opinions on what is the biggest news story in the world for the last 6 months. What I do think is a little bit strange, and I've always thought this about sort of discourse around Israel, is that people seem to care about it, and people seem to amp up the discourse to a level that if it was about anyone else, you'd think it was crazy. There was a ethnic sectarian conflict in Armenia and Azerbaijan in September 2023. No one really has opinions on that. You wouldn't find someone in the street that has a well-formed, strong opinion about it. And it just seems that people, when it comes to Israel, it has to be this like absolutely like hyperbolic, insane reaction that I don't think necessarily warrants, isn't necessarily reflective of the reality.
And I suppose that then is the flip side of this thing you often hear about all Jewish people being having to answer questions about the actions of the Israeli government, which they've got nothing to do with. Can you not flip that around and to then be to ask somebody who is taking actions based on their perception of the Israeli government, that then, Jeffrey, don't you have to then take similar actions every time you see the similar injustice anywhere?
Yeah, I mean,
you have to become like a fool to like every conflict everywhere in the world. You have to like trim your life to reflect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a sad state of our world that there is a lot of conflict happening. I think fundamentally it is hard to not necessarily keep track of it all, but I think the Armenian example is interesting because I think Armenia in that year was not able to compete in Eurovision because of the war. So these things come into Eurovision, and I think In many ways, my position on this comes from a view of wanting to see less war and less human suffering, so there's less to keep track of. And so I think that is where fundamentally I sort of come from, is that we need to stop injustices wherever that comes from and whatever the country is that's perpetrating it.
Okay, so go back to that, you humming along to Netta, and I'm not sort of like trying to like prosecute you for singing along to that, but it just raises the prospect of like what boycotting actually is. So this time around, you're not going to watch the Eurovision Song Contest in any form.
No, yeah. I think when we're talking about boycotting and cultural boycotting, it is essentially, it's not watching Eurovision, but I don't think I think that's too simple of an answer to that question, because I think, what does that really achieve? Does me not watching something on a Saturday night do anything to actually help materially Palestinian people who need help? No. So probably what I'll be doing is there'll be alternative sort of Eurovision events. I think the Rio that we talked about at the top of the program has said they'll be hosting an alternative event that I think will be a fundraiser for medical aid for Palestine or something similar. So I would probably go to something like that, because I think it is not simply enough to just say, oh no, this is, I'm not a good person because I don't watch something, right? Boycott has to achieve something and raise awareness. And I think, importantly, Josh sort of earlier talked about, what does cultural boycotting really achieve? What does it do? And I think it's part of a wider program of boycotting. And I think it's important to mention that the boycott of Eurovision has been called for by the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions organization. So it is a Palestinian-led call to do so. I think it is about creating a conversation around what's happening and raising awareness, because I think the flip side to not doing this is that we further amplify the silence of Palestinian voices. And so if we're not boycotting, we're not talking about what's happening, and that's a real problem.
And the Rio you refer to is, the cinema in East London, that usually has a watch party. This year they're not having it, and instead they're going to have some fundraising things instead. Josh, the word boycott's been associated to lots of things related to Israel for years. What's kind of your settled view on it as a tactic?
Yeah, look, I think it's a valid form of protest. I'm not going to say you should ban people boycotting.
Have you boycotted anything ever?
No, I'm a big supporter of everything all the time. Always.
You don't seem like a boycotting kind of person.
No, but I think the thing